Uh, okay, let's get on with today's business. We have with us today Joe Echevarria, who is CEO of Deloitte. He joined Deloitte US in 1978 and became an audit partner in 1988. Since that time, he has held a wide range of leadership positions, most recently U.S. Managing Partner Operations. His leadership responsibilities extend to approximately 50,000 professionals. He is also actively engaged on Capitol Hill as part of the federal practice growth strategy and has testified before numerous commissions and agencies. Outside of Deloitte, Joe balances a career and family life with his wife, Anna, who is an IT consultant for Bacardi, and their 3 children. He is involved in community organizations, serving on the Orange Bowl Committee, we might get there someday, and as a corporate advisory, we will get there, as a corporate advisory board member of the Association of Latino Professionals in Finance and Accounting. He was named Executive of the Year by that organization in 2007. Joe earned his bachelor's degree in business administration from the University of Miami in Coral Gables, Florida. Joe, welcome.
Well, thank you. It's quite an introduction. I got one question, though, and Buzz was helpful for me here. How many in this group are fans of The Ohio State University? A few? Just a few? Not a bunch? Just a few? Any other universities represented in this fine group? No? None? Penn State? Washington State? Back of the room? Louisiana State as an LSU? Yes. Purdue, Boilermaker? Michigan, Harvard. Harvard is in vogue in New York these days with insanity. Nobody from Miami of Ohio? How did that name get there? As someone who went to the University of Miami, I've always struggled with that. The reason I ask the question is because, well, it's a privilege to be here today, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak, and I won't be long, I promise you. First of all, I have my partners here, sitting here, giving me the eye, so I'll be quick. But this is part of a 10-year journey for me, personally. It's taken me 10 years to get to this podium, and it really was driven around an acceptance of sort of a reckoning. So when I get off the plane, I've come to Columbus various times, but to get behind this podium, it's almost sort of rehabilitating, because it was in January of 2003 where my life was forever marked by a little yellow flag, okay, that was in the back of an end zone, okay, when my famed alma mater believed that we had won our 6th national championship against The Ohio State University. And I think I danced for what seemed like 30 minutes, but it was only 3 minutes. Some say it was 10 seconds. And yeah, I know. Gamble was in bounds, right? We caught that ball, he was in bounds. It should never have come down. See, I knew that fact. So this is the last part of my recovery to get over the fact, because ever since then, my esteemed university football program has been on a steady decline. Right? If you had told me back that day that the University of Miami School of Business, which is ranked 37th in the United States, would outrank the football program by some 30 notches, I said, impossible. But that's the case today, as we struggle back, and it all stems from that little yellow flag at the back of the end zone. Okay? So if you hear a little trembling in my voice, that's really what it's about. So this is sort of a completion of a cycle, and I really welcome the opportunity to be back with all of you. And like I said, I was at that game, and I've been to this great city many times. We have great clients in this town, so I appreciate the opportunity. So number one, there really is nothing on my resume that would suggest that I should be speaking to you on any behalf whatsoever. CEO of a professional service firm, interesting, not terribly relevant. But the one thing that I do have, one benefit I do have representing my partners is that I get to see some of the leading companies in the world, many represented here in the room today, and I get to be in those audiences with them and hear their perspectives. Whether it's about politics, whether it's about the economy, you pick, but I get to hear it firsthand. And then I have a filter that's a little different. I don't know, is anybody in this room a first-generation born American? There's 2 of us, a couple of us. So my migration starts Spain. My parents go Spain, Puerto Rico, and at some point in the passage, the United States decides everybody who's in Puerto Rico automatically becomes a citizen, and we came to New York City, they did. And so I'm first generation born American, and that puts a little bit of a different bend on how I process things in terms of the American dream, because I have to tell you, when you think about this country, that's the way I process it. So if you put all that together, that's what I'll spend 10 minutes, I promise you, no more of my time talking about with all of you. So first, and I was talking here in the front of the room, I've learned an awful lot being in Washington. I was not prepared. I've only been the CEO for 7 months. I was ill-prepared to go to Washington, because I went to Washington ideally believing that rational thought would carry the day. And while it carries a lot of the dialogue, it doesn't carry the day in the end. It's a lot bigger landscape. And so some of what I'll say will be through that lens. And so when I think about today, and I think about America's recovery or America's comeback, you pick the words. I'll just give you a few thoughts. But the first thing I would start with is that while I recognize that us as a country, a nation, all of us as people, some of us are not so sure of our standing in the world anymore. A lot of the attention goes to the emerging markets. You pick whichever it is. And that may all be true. And the challenges are daunting today for the United States, daunting for America. But we've overcome every challenge we've ever been faced with, because that's what we do. And so I'm going to begin this by telling you that in my view, and that the benefit of all of you who I get to speak to, America's best days lie ahead. So that's the premise that I wanted, because that's what I believe, based on what you believe, quite frankly. So when we get to the Q&A, I really want you to challenge whatever thinking you have around that, because that's how I actually get informed about what we see in the world. So if you move past that, a little bit of context. And I'm not going to tell you anything you don't know, but I'm going to distill down everything I've heard. Where are we today? Job market, right? Jobs look a little better. That's a fair statement. But at the current pace in the job market today, it would still take about 12, 24 months to get to a full employment economy. So that would basically mean that we would have been in a labor recession for almost 7 years. It's a long time. That's number one. Budget paralysis in Washington, I don't think that's much of a surprise. Tax reform, or lack thereof, not much of a surprise. Regulation, not much of a surprise in terms of where that is. So if you put that all together, I would say most of the companies that I get to visit foundationally say that this year being 2012, will be small growth, small top line, a little better on the bottom line, but through productivity gains, not through employment gains. And in that small growth, essentially that's a stall speed, 2%, 3%, you pick the number. So that just means that they're subject to great shocks in the system. What would the shocks be? Not terribly complicated. They'd be Europe. You can read the paper every day, right? Every day Greek deal's on, the Greek deal's off. Maybe it's on. Now there's a deal on, but everybody's worried it's going to stick, right? China's on a soft landing. And then consumer spending, which obviously sort of ebbs and flows. The reports are pretty good in January. So when you have a stall speed environment, at least those who I get to talk with believe that's the risk we have. If we were sitting at an 8% growth, we wouldn't be worried. Okay, that makes sense. If you think more broadly, then, what is the context of the world that we're going to be in? And I'll just share a couple of data points with you because there are so many. But if I distilled it down to some of the best thoughts that were given to me, so where could it go? So the one thing that I would say very clearly is that someone said this to me, so these are not my words, but they were terrific and impactful to me. What people think is impossible is just something they haven't seen before. That's it. What you haven't seen before. Did you ever think that the U.S. market, the debt market, would be downgraded? Never did you believe that to be possible. But it happened. So now this generation of people will always think that that's possible. The only thing I'm going to read to you, I promise, I don't usually read from anything, but I'm going to read to you two quotes because I want to make sure I get them right. This comes from late 2006, so this is about 6 months before the crisis actually starts to unfold. Here's one quote. I think we are unlikely to see growth being derailed by the housing market. Chairman Bernanke said that at a Fed Open Market Committee meeting. We see a pretty healthy adjustment process. The world economy still looks really robust to us. Timothy Geithner at the same meeting in 2006. So here are individuals, this is not a criticism of them, here are individuals, informed, brilliant people with as many facts as anybody could possibly have. And that's a perspective they have literally 6 months away from what becomes the Great Recession. That's what I mean by saying what people think is impossible is something they haven't seen before. And those are the only quotes that I will read you. But that is essentially what they said. Now, let me give you some interesting three sets that are shaping the world today. So while we sit in recession and economy and worrying about that, there are three things, though, three data points around demographics, around regulation, and around consumers that I found very interesting. One, demographics. The world is getting older, but for the United States. But for the United States. So what do I mean? The average person of 65 or older is about 10% of the population of China today. In 2025, that'll double. By 2050, that'll triple. That's not the case in the United States because they have a population issue to challenge. That is the case in Europe and in most of the East. Second, there were 14,000 new regulations came into play around the world in 2011, up from 10,000 in 2010. Dodd-Frank still has 80% of the rules to be written on an 850-page law. Just think about that. Now let me give you a consumer data point that shapes the world. There was a recent survey done by, I think it was Gartner, and the question was, what would you rather have, access to the internet or own and drive your own car? And they made them have a choice, thank goodness. Because the answer, 50% of the people between 18 and 24, the kids, I think of them as kids because I have two in that age range, voted for internet access over driving a car. 50%. For our generation, it was less than 10% in that same vote. Now, I'm sure if they said you could have internet access in your car, it would have skyrocketed. Thank God that wasn't the question that I got asked, but that's telling, isn't it? And 50% of the 16-year-olds used to have driver's licenses 10 years ago. Now it's down to 30%, which I actually think I take some comfort in that fact, personally, because I have a 16-year-old. But just think of that change in those three dimensions. So if you process those, you process the impossible, then you go, so what is possible then? So with that as background, what is possible? So when we talk about a stronger American recovery, I really process it in some very simple dimensions. And this doesn't come from my thinking. Remember, this is just an amalgamation of what I've heard and how I watch it play in Washington. And some of this is going to seem Buzz and I are talking about, very basic, and you're going to go, well, that seems simple and obvious. I have to tell you, in Washington, simple and obvious is where you have to go. Simple and obvious where you have to start, because it has to be doable. Because in the political realm, it's far more complicated than just doing what we perceive to be the right thing. It's not that simple. So, if you start off with a premise, and one of the CEOs said this to me, I thought they were right on. CEOs, business leaders, have no difference in terms of responsibilities in government. Trust and confidence, maintain that, right? Maximize assets, I think we'd all agree with that. Facilitate growth, and make sure that you give back to a productive society. Whether you're CEO, CFO, business, community leader, those would be the similar. So if you put it in that vein, some basics would have to be done, right? So fiscal responsibility would be the first thing. Would anybody here, any business, any company that you have, would any of you think that it would be a productive business model to have 7 times the debt of your revenue? 7 times. Well, that's what we have in the United States, 7 times the debt. Would you have a business model that suggests you could spend $4.4 trillion when your revenue is only $2.5 trillion? Would that be sustainable? Probably not. Probably not. Would you have a tax system and a regulatory system that essentially thinks of competition within the boundaries of the United States when the rest of the world is building companies to compete against American companies? ExxonMobil, I believe, second or third largest company in the United States, depending on market caps, barely in the top 10 globally. Because the rest of the world is building big companies to compete against the United States, and we worry about competition within the boundaries of the United States. That's a competitive disadvantage when you go global. That's not the way the rest of the world processes, but we do. So we build regulation with that mindset. Sounds simple, and I'm not going to take sides here because I'm not smart enough, but the recent transaction between AT&T and T-Mobile was rejected. Would have only made AT&T the 6th largest company in the world. That's all. So what's going to happen instead is foundationally, spectrum is limited, so pricing is going to go up for all of us as consumers, but we'll have more choices in the United States. That's what I'm talking about. So that's the fourth pivot point. We really think about regulation. And I really think that foundation is the last thing. And this is something that I learned when I was over in Davos, and so representing my partners. This notion of you have to take all that through a lens of compassionate capitalism. I mean, I sit here today, first generation born American, living the American dream, grew up in the South Bronx, right outside Yankee Stadium, was a recipient of great government programs. And here I'm sitting before an austere group of individuals behind a lectern talking about the American economy. That's compassionate capitalism, in my view. One thing I learned when I was in Davos, and it came to me from some of the world leaders, was that there was a real struggle over the notion in the United States, in America, the difference between top decile wage earners and bottom decile wage earners in terms of income over the last 20 years is 4x. The world average is not even 2x. So we've moved the gap 4x versus the rest of the world. And you can debate whether that's good or bad, doesn't matter, but we're an outlier in that model, which you might see resurrect around the world. And I think compassionate capitalism is nothing more than a recognition of that fact, number one. And number two, these aren't my words, but I thought they were well written, that we tend to think that the challenge of the next century is going to be around whether state capitalist societies works, so think of the Chinas of the world, or a market-driven works, the United States, and then take Europe, and they're sort of in the middle, whether that's the real contest. And I would suggest, and the notion of this person suggests that that's not the real contest at all, quite frankly. That's just a red herring. The real contest is going to be what will mark the next century, the century we're in today, is really struggling over the balance between the economic institutions that create wealth and the political systems that redistribute and regulate wealth. The system that gets that right will mark the century. But it's not state versus market. That's the fundamental issue. So when we talk about compassionate capitalism, that's really a better way to say it. And the premise under that is that the century will be marked not by the country's laws, not by just the institutions who create rapid growth, but those who do that. They do that better than anybody else, and they share the fruits of that growth in a way that society and the citizens of that nation believe is just. All the citizens. That's who will mark the century. That's compassionate capitalism. So when we talk about tax reform, you talk about deficits, that's the lens it has to be processed through. Don't know what the answer is, but the premise there, and I thought it was pretty fascinating, was that. So I'll just close with the thought that I opened with, personally. Again, as a firstborn generation American, it is easy to get lost in the fact of debating our standing in the world. Easy. It's real easy. The issues, the challenges, to not feel good, 7-year labor recession, top desk, you pick. Easy, it is real easy. But I have to tell you, if you look at some facts, just a few facts, I think you might have a different perspective about that. I know I do. So fact number one is, the U.S. economy is by far the largest in the world, 3 times larger than the next one, China, 5 times larger than one after that, Germany. I said, well, yeah, but China's going to catch us. Not in this century. Not in this century, they're not. We have 3 times the size of the economy at 15 trillion. They have 4 times the number of people that we have. On a per-person basis, it'll take 87 years to catch the United States at today's growth models. 87 years. I think it was today's Wall Street Journal. There's even an article in it about the wealthy in China coming to the United States and Europe for that very reason. So that's number one. Our economy is big. We are the world's reserve currency. The dollar is. That's not going to change. 90% of the foreign currency transactions are conducted in dollars. You know what they are on the yuan? 0.3%. There's no alternative to what we do. Our demographics are amazing in this country. Remember I talked about the aging population? A, we don't have the aging population, and B, we have consistent birth rates, but we have something else that no other country has. And put aside your states, people come to America to become Americans. That doesn't exist almost anywhere in the world. When I was in Davos, what they said to me was, America is the envy of the world. They are the envy of the world. Don't lose sight of the fact that America is the envy of the world. People come to America to become Americans. Challenge your thinking and tell me where else that really happens in mass. Put aside, I'm talking about legal immigration. People come to America to become Americans. That's what makes us different. That salient fact. I'm first generation. I got here on the backs of your parents, and they supported whatever governmental system was in place at the time, and they gave me this opportunity to become a citizen, my parents, and to stand here before you. That's America. And so when I came home from Davos, I actually came back with a far greater appreciation of this country. So I started this when I said before, while there are some who debate whether America is irreplaceable, there are none, everybody believes it's indispensable in the world theater. Everybody I talked to, every single person believed America was indispensable in the world theater. So I start with saying, there was remember I said in the beginning, I believe America's best days are ahead of it. There was a great line I read somewhere. It's one thing to dream, it's another to believe. Me, I believe in America. So thank you.
Thanks, Joe. That's really positive and somewhat inspirational. Thank you very much. We don't hear that kind of comment all the time. The Metropolitan Club, as you all know who have been here before, entertains questions, and Joe is as willing to take some questions, and I'm sure there will be some. I want to tell you that this is all being recorded. It'll appear on ONN. It will also appear on our website, and streaming on the website and the Metropolitan Library's website. So if you come to the mic, introduce yourself, just state your name, and we'd appreciate no long sort of semi-political comments. But you can make them if you'll take them. All right.
Well, the old poly is many and ticks are bloodsuckers. So you can start with that. You mentioned that the rest of the world is creating big companies.
Yes.
We seem to see our younger generation, the 20-year-olds and the 30-year-olds, seem to be kind of disillusioned. At least that's what I perceive with the big companies. So what's the answer for that, not only for your organization, but your client's organization?
Absolutely. And I think it's a fair statement, and that's the challenge that we have. Part of it is this generation of my children. So I have three, go from 24 to 16. I have three. And as a nation, it's the first time in our history, all of us, that our children, using financial measures as success, will not outperform the previous generation. It's the first time it's ever happened. So it starts with that premise, because that's not what they're interested in. They're not interested in that element of it. And I think what we have to unbundle is the notion that what they are interested in runs counter to big and great, because they put the two together. And that's the challenge. That while we have great demographics, you're absolutely right. So when I think of my own children in that question, they all the time say, "Dad, I don't need to work as hard as you. I don't need to work as hard as you, Dad. I don't want to work as hard as you." I said, "Well, let's wait." Because when you want to buy that car that you were voting on or internet access, at some point you're going to have to work. And I think that's the challenge. But I do think that somehow, I don't have the empirical answer for you, but somehow Americans find a way to be better. I can't even explain it to you, because I could just give you all the things they put up here. But that's a great question. That's a fantastic question. I don't have the answer to it or the silver bullet to it, other than recognition, and when they become global travelers, they have a better appreciation for this country. And they are really interested in helping the world. They are interested in that, and that might shape perspective for them. Great question. Thank you.
Hi, Andy Campbell. One of your data points clearly was, in regards to our national income. You talked about revenue versus expenditure in the national debt. Historically, everything great that's made this nation has been infrastructure and spending, and you have to have revenue for that. But in the current times, taxes are political kryptonite. I mean, irregardless of party. How do you overcome that? You hear a lot about fair share, and I think there's some buy-in that the wealthier Americans are willing to pay a fairer share, and yet that seems to get nowhere in Congress. Sorry, Congressman Stivers. How do you overcome this idea of tax being a four-letter word?
Yeah, I don't think it's a four-letter word. I think it's, once you get past season, we're just in season now, and that's understandable. I think when you get past season, I think there's a recognition that we'll get to a bipartisan answer on tax. And there has to be more of a sharing, and you pick whatever that sharing is. You pick, Warren Buffett has his view. I don't know how much he represents of the total tax base. But I know, for example, one of the clients I serve, a big public company, represents 5% of the tax revenue in the United States. Just one institution does. And so you got to balance those choices out. I think the tax issue plays out. I think the president even had a proposal today. I think it was on today's Wall Street Journal, a new proposal. Effective rate, eliminate some of the deductibility, if you will, to increase proceeds. But I do think that foundationally you have to balance the tax question with the spending question. They're both. Neither one is the answer. So on the spending question, are there ways to improve and maximize the efficiencies of the government, just like everybody has to do? I mean, there are some best practices in corporate entities. Procurement's a best practice. In fact, Defense Department just did it. They did a partnership with a vendor, and they were able to partner with them as opposed to the traditional bid process and take out $500 million of spend without jeopardizing. So there's a lot to be gained there. But I do think in Washington, there's a real sensitivity to it. And I think that by and large, there's a recognition. It's just not the time, that's all. It's just not the time today. I do think, I have the utmost faith, though, in what happens there. But it's complicated. There's a lot of constituencies that have to be involved. And the foundational issue for us as business owners is that we violated the trust of society. We just have to accept that. You get regulated when the consumer loses faith in you. And we have to recognize that that's what happened. And I don't mean everybody, but business in general, well, that's the consequence. That's the consequence, and we have to recognize that. That's that distribution, and I do think that in Washington there's a great recognition of that, and I think business will ultimately get to that recognition. But it works both sides of the ledger, the tax side, the spending side. I have the utmost faith that that will get done, because it always gets done, because this is still the best system in the world, notwithstanding anybody.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
My name is Jordan Davis, and I have a question relative to you on task, but with, in particular with education. So I have a two-part question. One, I think we're an envy of the world in terms of higher education. And in Ohio, in Columbus, we're a hotbed for students and for intellectual capital. But we do have an extremely large population of foreign students. We educate them here. We bring them to a level that we would be honored if they could stay and contribute to our society. But then we export them back home, and they're contributing to these foreign communities that in turn are competing against us, right? So how do you change that? What's the impact? Where do you see that going in the future? And then the second thing is this workforce development component in our education, and how are those two becoming streamlined, or where do you see that and how that is all a factor in your work?
Sure. And so the first question is immigration, and there's a balance issue. It's hard to debate immigration when in this country you have 8-9% of the people unemployed already. So part of the balance of immigration is that very foundational question. I think when you're in a full employment model, the immigration model looks a little different. But this country was built, unless you're a Native American Indian, unless you're that, this country was built on immigration, but legal immigration. I say that all the time, legal immigration. I think in Washington today, there's a recognition, but you have the two debates. And we have 9% of our own citizens unemployed. So educating and transferring is part of is the theater that America's part. Remember I talked about we may not be irreplaceable, but I do think we're indispensable. One of the things we do around the world is just that, what you just said. And I think that makes us better. And we'll balance the immigration issue over time when the U.S. employment issue is settled, which is not today, And when I was in the White House, one of the great questions they said was, before you give a job outside the United States, I want you to ask yourself, can you give that job to someone in the United States? There's some way you can do it. It was a great question. It was a fantastic question. If you gave up a little bit of the profit orientation, could you do it? It was a fair question. That's the first part. The second part of the integration of the model, I think we have a ways to go there because we're so big. I mean, here's one. You're in a community here. You happen to be in one where there's not many, at least that I travel to, where the largest education institution sits in the capital, and the capital is a major metropolitan area. All of those together. That makes this Columbus pretty unique. You know, it happens in a few, but not in many. And as a consequence, you have a different lens here about that issue. So I'm New York City. I mean, there really isn't any. We have lots of universities, but New York City, but the capital's in Albany, and the biggest institutions don't sit in Albany. And so we don't have that partnership quite worked out because the urban centers tend to be different from where the education centers are. That to me is a harder one to do than the first one. Harder. Yes, sir. I apologize. You're supposed to be running the control, not me.
Hi, Bill Lafayette. My question centers on the idea that we seem to be kind of in this gridlock situation. It's a huge frustration when I see in Washington the idea that if I lose, you will win, and I don't want to lose, and so I'm not going to give an inch so that I don't lose. And so how do we solve our problems if that's the orientation? And is it as bad as it's being portrayed in the media?
Well, you know, maybe absolutely can answer the question for me. And because I was going to give an answer that said, from someone who comes from where linsanity is the focal point of the media, where a guy who plays 7 basketball games is all over the press, okay? I can assure you the media have hyped it up beyond what it is, regardless. Okay? But
I think that's right. I mean, I think it is overhyped, but I also think that, there are certainly folks on the extremes that control the dialogue, and that's part of the problem in bringing folks together, and it's been frustrating. I've only been in Washington 13 months, but it has been frustrating that the dialogue gets away from folks who want to come together and do the right thing, because folks on the extreme, it's easy to get them on TV, they love to be on TV, so you hear the extremes, you don't always hear the folks in the middle. And I found that most of the members of the House and Senate, are within 15 degrees of the center and really want to work together. This isn't exactly the best time of year to do that, right, with the election coming up, but I have faith in our system. I think things will work out. I mean, the other thing that, just being there a year, and I'm going on too long, just think about the government shut down in March. That worked out. It went up to the end. It was ugly, but it worked out. The debt limit in August, we went up to the end, but it worked out. Just this last week on the payroll tax extension, we went to the very end. There's no sense in doing things too early in Washington. It's just, but it usually works.
well, that was my closing point.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you very much.
Congressman Stivers. Yes.
No, it's much better to hear from someone who actually has facts about it and knows about it than someone who's pontificating from the outside. But I'll tell you that when I was there, I still put our stake in our country. Our system, for whatever we think about it, is still the best and proven to be the best, at least through 2012. And I have no reason to believe that's not going to continue. And so when you're in Washington, and you heard it firsthand, we have a system of checks and balances, and that's what it's about. And so you have the Hill, you have the regulatory side, you have the executive branch, and the best times of prosperity weren't necessarily when someone controlled all the institutions, is when the center all had a similar point of view. But this was the Great Recession, and so we should expect the fact that there are going to be challenges in this. But it's a difficult job, and so 13 months, 7 months, so between us we have 20 whole months of experience. So put it in that context that, or at least I'm a rookie, he's almost a wily veteran compared to me.
Good afternoon, Robert Shenton. We talked about size of corporations, both globally as well as here. My question centers around speed. So in your travels, how do you see us as an economy doing with regards to keeping up with the pace of things and the speed at which business is moving versus our peers in other foreign entities? Are we ahead, behind, but how are we doing with addressing the speed or pace of the economy, regulation-wise and such?
I would say, regulation is I come to learn. And one of my businesses that we're in, the audit business that we're in, which is the trust business, is a regulated business. So I experience regulation. Regulation goes in a pendulum. Unfortunately, we all like it to stop right in the middle, but it swings to one side or the other. It never stops in the middle, okay? Because if it stopped in the middle, to the point here, it would all be great, but it doesn't. It goes with momentum. And so now we're sort of at, in my mind, the apex of it. We're at the apex of it, and it's starting its wind down. But put aside how we got here, the government's response to how we got here has been far superior than other countries' response. The EU is still at a point of whether it will exist or not. Will exist. We're not having that conversation here. I mean, I just talked about the world's currency is the dollar. Okay, it's not the euro. And so our model still is nimble enough, but it's never nimble enough for Americans. My UK colleagues tell me all the time that you Americans, you're just a bunch of teenagers. Okay? You've been around, what, a couple of 100 years? Come see me after 3,000 or 4,000 years and tell me how it worked out. That's what they say. But we're anxious. We're anxious. We want immediate results. We want it to be fixed. What we've accomplished in 300 years is spectacular. So our system is outperforming everybody else. Sure, China's system is building in percentage terms better. But like I said, front page of today's Wall Street Journal, the wealthy coming here for what? Safety, financial security, education, environment issues, talking about coming to the United States or Europe. That's our system. Thank you for the question.
Roger Blackwell. I heard on WSU driving in this morning that the president has suggested a number of changes in the tax code for corporations, very detailed ones apparently. And my question, as a person who has experience, as you do, in all of the tax code reporting requirements, what changes? I mean, we've heard suggestions that dividends should be deductible as well as interest, maybe in place of interest.
Right.
Annual reporting instead of quarterly to get a longer-term view instead of the short-term view that leads
Right.
to manipulation and all this sort of thing, and a lot of other sorts of things. To stimulate the economy and maybe create jobs, because we've heard that rapid depreciation instead of matching actual depreciation with revenues causes unemployment. What would be your suggestions if the president were to ask you for how the code for corporate taxes should be changed?
Well, if you were to ask me, and I'm holding out hope that he'll ask me, but it hasn't come yet, we just need a decision to be made. It almost doesn't matter what the decision is. We are living today under the Tax Simplification Act. Today. I don't know if anybody would think it's simple, but that's what we live under. It's not reasonable to think that the tax code is going to become any simpler or harder than it is today. It's just going to become different than it is today to try to deal with the regulatory issues and the balance. What we need in corporate America, anyway, is a conclusion. We just need to know what the answer is. It almost doesn't matter what the answer is. We just need an answer. Because without predictability, we're on the sideline. We're just on the sideline, waiting for the answer. Like I said, we wouldn't exist as an enterprise. If the tax code was simple enough that every person could just pick it up and understand and do it, then we wouldn't exist. But that's just not going to be the case. That's not practical. So to me, we just need an answer. If you go to any of the America, they just give me the answer. Just tell me what it is. If the answer is eliminate some deductions and make the corporate tax 25%, terrific. If the answer is leave them all in and make it 40%, terrific. If the answer is tax individuals at 50%, terrific. You pick, but we need an answer. Because government doesn't really create jobs itself. The private sector ultimately creates the jobs. And so for us, it's really about that. I think the biggest challenge we have in the tax arena is lack of a conclusion. It almost doesn't matter what the conclusion is at this point. We just need one. And that would be my answer. And there's lots of details behind that. But I think what the president, remember that pendulum? So the pendulum is starting to come back. All of a sudden, the conversation is about, well, the total rate is going to be reduced. But there's going to be pieces that are going to be eliminated in the conversation. Okay, that's great. I mean, a couple weeks ago it was tax the wealthy, the 1% at a number. You picked a number. That was okay. I think that's the issue. Lack of a conclusion is the issue for us. And that's what if you ever asked, that's what I would tell them. Just decide. Decide. Whatever it is. And let's get on with it. But the reality is you got to get past the elections. So this is all posturing around the elections. But once the election is over, all of that will get done. My view, anyway. Great question.
Any further questions? Joe, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, thanks to your partners as well at Deloitte. As always, we continue the conversation out in the lobby. There's some coffee and cookies out there. Also want to remind you of Friday's program at COSI, and don't forget breakfast with Arnold. So.